Fantasy Animation Podcast takes its listeners on a journey through the colliding and sometimes competing worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Each episode, we select an example of fantasy animation and consider the ways in which it functions to inspire and use our imaginations within the sphere of all things that are sculpted, composed, crafted, and drawn. To help support the show, please subscribe via your podcast feed and give us a like and a quick review. It takes no more than a minute, but it really helps us to grow our audience. You can also find our archive of podcasts and our weekly blog at fantasy-animation.org. You'll find the latest reviews there, features, editorials, all written by academics, writers, historians, and professional animators working within these overlapping media, mediums, and genres. Failing all that, tell your friends, tell a friend about the show and the good work we do here. There's no substitution for good old-fashioned word of mouth, so thanks for downloading, and I really hope you enjoy the show.
Hi listeners and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent. The Force is with me and I am the Force.
Right. Thanks.
I think I've already butchered that line.
You have, yeah. And we're not gonna cut it out.
A Jedi Knight I will not make.
No. As you might have gathered, in this episode we are returning to the world of Star Wars, having done, I think, a couple of the sequel films in previous episodes. But for this instalment, we're taking on Rogue One, one of the new anthology features released in 2016, directed by Gareth Edwards, who also has an excellent pedigree in animation as well. And an epic space opera it is, that tells the story of the creation of the Death Star in what is an immediate prequel to Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. Now, as you know, or hopefully you will know, my knowledge of Star Wars is patchy at best, but I'm interested in the film's use of holograms and, of course, perhaps most notably, its de-aging visual effects as it resurrects stars long since departed and, of course, reconjures them in pristine computer graphics. Alex, tell me about the fantasy of this space fantasy.
I mean, look at you saying words like Death Star, like you know
what
that means. I mean, I'm interested. I'm always interested with franchises like this on kind of lore building, mythology building, the relationship between kind of fantasies of old and fantasies of new. Nostalgia is a thing we've talked about in its relationship to fantasy, and I think it links to some of the stuff you want to talk about. So, and I've always argued and will continue to argue that Star Wars is more of a fantasy than a sci-fi, and that I might use the iconography of science fiction, but really at its heart, it's a story of mysticism and magic and other worlds. It replace a few space slugs with some goblins, and you're basically in a world of high fantasy here. So I'm excited to kind of go back into that world and continue to pick it apart a little.
Well, in order to help us separate our Jyn Ersos from our Cassian Andors, he says, reading the Wikipedia page, is Dr Jonathan Wroot, who's our guest for this episode and senior lecturer and program leader for film studies at the University of Greenwich. Now, Jonathan has previously published research on home media, formats and Asian cinema distribution, and he has co-edited a collection entitled New Blood, Framing 21st Century Horror in 2021, in addition to his monograph, which I think is now out, on Zatoichi. Across film and TV. Some of his research will also be appearing in the forthcoming edited collection Women in East Asian Cinema, and he's contributed to podcasts, so he's a seasoned pro, contributed to the podcast series Beyond Japan and Second Features, as well as the 2022 Japan Touring Film Programme. He has also brought donuts to this recording, so can definitely come again. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us and for the donuts.
You're very welcome.
So our starter for 10 is where Rogue One fits in your work, really. Perhaps not an obvious choice given your research and what I know about your research, but a film I think that I'm learning is a nice accompaniment to your monograph on Zatoichi, The Blind Swordsman. So why Rogue One?
Mainly because it wasn't just me that noticed it. I'm happy to say that many critics noticed it at the time when Rogue One came out in 2016. The character in it, Chirrut Îmwe, is basically Zatoichi in space, as the critics said.
Okay.
And I got this was a fun part of the book where I actually got to cite as many reviews as I could find where critics were making that comparison. Everyone from like Mark Kermode, who I found bizarrely of all places, the Yorkshire local news webpage. The critic there seems
cutting edge,
yeah, cutting edge. I know it was from all places of the world almost, because I swear there was an Australian review I cited too. Everyone seemed to recognise that he was Zatoichi in space, and there at the time that the film came out, I was putting the idea of the book together. So since then, I gathered as much information as that, as well as on the other Zatoichi films, and was using that to make a link to show the influence of this character, because that's the title of the book, The Paths of Zatoichi, the Global Influence of the Blind Swordsman.
Excellent.
Excellent example of that, of course, that this character is homaged in a Star Wars film. And it also shows the continuing influence of East Asian popular culture in Star Wars, because that's always been an influence on the franchise.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
I mean, so for the uninitiated, and I'm one of them.
Yeah. You put your hand up as well.
I put my hand up. It's because I've just eaten a Krispy Kreme for the first time in my life, and I'm absolutely buzzing off my tits.
Other donut brands are available.
Fine. Sure. Yes. So Zatoichi, what for those uninitiated, what is it? Where does it come from? And how can we spot one?
As I found in the book, Chris may be disappointed. There's not as many animated versions or homages of Zatoichi. There are a few I could go into. Yeah. But the character could mainly perhaps more fall in line with the camp of fantasy, because he is, as the name suggests, with the subtitle of so many films, he is the blind swordsman. How the hell can you be blind and also fight brilliantly with a sword? That's basically the premise of these films and the initial short story that the character was based on. So if you want to get technical with your history, the character first appears on page in 1948, and then the idea of the character from that story is quite different from how he appeared on screen. First appears on screen in 1962. This is again why I'm very happy that you have me on the podcast today, because we're in 2022, 60th anniversary of the film franchise. The first film turns up in 1962, and that's where also he's first played by Shintaro Katsu, who is primarily associated with this character, because he ended up playing Zatoichi on screen for 25 films made from 1962 to 1973, so churning them out at a phenomenal rate.
Yeah.
So he made those films, and then the popularity of the screen character faded away a little bit by the early 1970s.
Yep.
And then he switched to TV from 1974 to 79, played the character just for a small number of episodes, yet again, 100 on screen.
So the same actor is playing this character across different platforms. Okay,
yeah, 25 films, 100 TV episodes. Then the character's kind of star status, if you will, I think that's the best way to put it, kind of fades away a bit. He decides to then try and bring back the character again in 1989 for like this big comeback movie. Even the character's a bit older and so's the actor. Doesn't work, sadly. Ends up being one of his last screen roles because he passed away in 1997.
Okay.
But that's who he's primarily been associated with in Japan. I'll just quickly mention in 2003, you'll know that one, Chris, the Kitano version. There was a Japanese remake of the character, as well as in 2008 and 2010. And there's been some other international homages in the 20th century, but the most famous homages to come out in the 21st century are things like Daredevil, some other fan-made films that I've come across, one which is actually a Star Wars fan-made film, really interesting, called Hoshino. And then what we're getting you to today, of course, the perhaps most famous Zatoichi homage in terms of big-budget spectacle is Star Wars Rogue One.
So, first of all, that was amazing. Secondly, got me really excited. Well, I know because I've read it, but presumably I think when this episode comes out, there'll be a blog post written by Jonathan about the Zatoichi character. So what struck me is, this character has this enduring quality. This fictional character has this enduring quality, and seems to be a character that crops up, as you say in the book and the abridged blog, that a character that crops up at various moments. And I just wonder, I think if I was in a seminar with thinking about this, I'd be wondering why is the character emerging at particular moments? Are there market forces, kind of big contextual paradigms pressing down on Japan at the time, or why is it that this character keeps coming back and actually seems to have this afterlife within popular and, as you said, contemporary US television and a big franchise like Star Wars? Why is the character such an enduring, I guess, signpost maybe for a particular kind of myth?
That's a really excellent question, one I've tried to answer with the book, and I'm not sure if I have. I mean, there are some parallels that could be made to really iconic and long-running series and characters in Japan. Like some parallels that I were making were bizarrely enough, because that is like pure fantasy and sci-fi, is Godzilla. Because actually the number of characters have actually appeared in a similar number of films.
Right.
But the story is that often Zatoichi tells himself is that he was sick of being looked down upon and downtrodden in society, that at some point he's somehow got some training for a sword, and now he wanders around, and hidden in his cane is a sword which he'll draw when trouble comes looking for him.
Yeah, and then he joins the rebellion.
Well, yeah. On to that, so it sounds like there's elements of the character that shine with this, I don't know, very broad, popular archetype that we could see in the Western, and we can see in Rogue One, and we can see here the kind of lone masculine figure outside of society, a wanderer figure, and we can talk about sort of the domestication of work versus the sort of physicality of a character like that as kind of popular global reasons why that might happen. But does this character, in terms of Star Wars, because the character, so Chirrut, is it Îmwe?
Chirrut Îmwe, I believe.
I'm going to call him Chirrut. Chirrut is obviously a Jedi. He's a Force user.
He's Force sensitive, I think is the technical term I can't remember if it's the script writers who came up with that or the fans.
Right.
But he's technically Force sensitive. He's not a Jedi. It's established in the plot of Rogue One. He's a guardian. They're called the Guardian of the Wills, and they're kind of monk-like figures that guard this temple, the Temple of Jeddah in the film, which is a source of kyber crystals used to power the Jedi's lightsabers. Of course, when the Empire gets hold of them, that's another big plot line in the film. They're using that to fuel the Death Star.
Right. And we can talk about sort of the relationship between the Force and kind of Eastern mysticism and various religions which are kind of cobbled together in that mythology. But let's start with the origin character. Has the original character got that kind of spiritual or kind of fantastical supernatural purchase, or is his skills more kind of just in, is he more of a kind of super spy or a super samurai? Is he just very good at fighting, or is there any kind of mystical connection that helps explain his abilities?
That's a really good question. Again, I wish there was a more succinct answer, but there's actually lots to unpack there.
Sure.
I would say in the majority of the films, because I haven't watched them again recently, but for the purposes of the book, I did go through every Zatoichi film and also the TV episodes. Which aren't available legitimately. You have to find this stuff online. All the films pretty much are, but not on streaming services. They're still they're very niche and still just available on DVD. But going through all of them, there never seems to be a supernatural element to the character. You could argue this in terms of how is a blind man able to swing a sword and kill so many bad guys in these films. It's up to you if you want to put that fantastical element in. But there never seems to be any depiction of that. At most you see Shintaro Katsu maybe wiggle his ears, showing that he's super sensitive to hearing. Okay. And that might be part of it. Sometimes his sense of smell comes up. That comes up actually particularly in one of the very few, because there's not many, blind gunslinger films that have been inspired by Zatoichi. There were only two. One was 1971's Blind Man. The other was, I think it was 1992, a HBO movie, really random, called Blind Justice.
I mean, you mentioned so Rogue One, as I said, my Star Wars knowledge is patchy, and I guess I'm sort of interested in, one, the East Asian influence that you mentioned right at the start, the East Asian influence on the Star Wars universe, but also, I don't know, the place of this character who, I don't know whether he felt out of place, or in a world where you have this kind of fantastic range of characters, but also the way that the Star Wars films work with world building, the character seems very, very different to some other Star Wars-esque, some Star Wars type characters. So I don't know.
I'll offer guest privilege first. Do you want to see what you can tackle with that, and I'll jump in with anything.
What is Rogue One?
It's kind of interesting. I think this is right, Alex, if I remember all the feature films of Star Wars that have come out, because I know there's actually been a few other spin-off films before we got to the latest anthology ones. But if I'm right, it might be one of the first feature films without a Jedi. character.
Yeah,
although you could argue, I mean, there are Sith characters. Darth Vader is in there, of course. But the Jedi don't. Initially, how this film was marketed, I'm immediately thinking of the film isn't that focused on Jedi. And I remember Gareth Edwards saying one of their main ideas the film was to emphasise the wars in the titles of Star Wars. So this plays out very much like a war
film. And crucially, it's the first film outside the Skywalker saga.
Yeah, there's no Skywalkers in it. Well, again, unless you
if we count Darth Vader, but the protagonists aren't based on that story that's been told and retold and continued to be told. So exactly right. So there's that. I think that's interesting in how I might approach this as a prequel. But I'd like to pick up on the issues of East Asia, how it fits within the original Star Wars trilogy, but also what the original Star Wars was doing with kind of a broad philosophy.
Well, I think Chirrut Îmwe helps to illustrate that, the character of Chirrut Îmwe and his companion character as well, Malbus, played by Jiang Wen. These are two massive Chinese, I think they're both from Hong Kong actually, actors. And I think they're partially brought in for that reason, to help play to the international audience with those massive characters. But also, particularly the character of Chirrut does help to illustrate the long association that the Star Wars franchise has had, or indeed the inspiration it's taken from East Asian popular culture. So I think we see a lot of that in Chirrut, which you can see in other characters in the Star Wars universe too, whether they're a Jedi or not. I think the whole notion of the Jedi is quite East Asian. And even though he's technically not a Jedi, Chirrut in Rogue One helps to illustrate this. In terms of the Jedi are often portrayed, particularly where we see a lot more of them in the prequels and some of the other films, as like these very almost religious order, or sometimes they're derogatively called as like religious wizards or religious monks, that sort of character. They have these fantastic combat abilities, but they're also meant to be very in line with the Force and the lighter side of the Force, that sort of thing, which Chirrut very much seems to be on, but he's also kind of a guardian for this power that he doesn't kind of have access to in terms of guarding the Kyber crystals on Jeddah, which ultimately are stolen away from there by the Empire. And his character and how he's portrayed as well, it has a lot of linkage with Donnie Yen's career, as well as popular characters in East Asian culture, because basically he is portraying a monk there, if we stick with that comparison. So if you stick with the monk comparison, there's very popular characters in lots of Hong Kong action cinema, like Shaolin monks, who are, again, trained in very specific ways of combat, but also are following a strict religious code. So he could be read in that way. And again, it kind of takes us back to all the East Asian influences that have inspired the Jedi. I mean, you just have to look at a lightsaber to realize it looks very similar to how samurai swords are held. George Lucas has mentioned in several interviews since the original Star Wars trilogy, he was taking a lot of cues from Akira Kurosawa films where samurai were depicted. Lots of people have said, especially with Darth Vader's armor, especially from those first designs, looks very much like the old samurai warriors. And there's been some other Japanese films, some of them are quite bizarre actually, since that have tried to, retrofit the Star Wars iconography into the Japanese medieval setting, to kind of emphasize that link. Lots of ideas from Star Wars came from our old Japanese films.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, also very famously, Lucas used Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces to sort of base he says to kind of give him a template for the screenplay of the original Star Wars, right? Which I think it's a controversial book and a controversial thing, because it's controversial for two reasons, I think. Artistically, it's controversial because it seems to suggest that good stories can only be created if you follow a rubric created by a kind of structuralist, formalist theorist of folklore, and not necessarily a terrific one at that, if I'm to be controversial. And then it's kind of it's socially and culturally controversial because, by its very nature, it's trying to find these kind of overwhelming structures for all stories, and therefore doesn't really pay specificity to the kind of cultural context in which stories take place, right? So I think the Force is a kind of lovely manifestation of this, in that everyone sort of thinks they understand the mythology of Star Wars, but actually if you listen to what is explicitly explained, there's very little kind of there to kind of get your head around it. But it's kind of a bit like Zen, but that's kind of doing a disservice to the kind of nuances.
And then when the prequels tried to explain midi-chlorians, that just seemed to annoy everyone, didn't it? Yeah.
So it almost like the way this franchise treats the Force, I find interesting as a genre theorist, because almost that's is it a fantasy or is it a sci-fi? Because if it's a fantasy, the impulse should be, you don't need to explain it. You've got a cool term. You can do some fun things with it. People are latching onto it. Let it be a mystery, and that will be the fun of it. But sometimes this franchise feels the need to explain, and that's where it goes down actually more sci-fi. Anytime it tries to rationalize, actually fans tend to push against it, particularly when it comes to the Force. So I think this is an interesting movie to think that through, because on the one hand, the origin story is doing a bit of rationalizing. We get an explanation as how the Death Star works, and it's drawing from the same stuff. So we're having an explanation as to how the Jedi stuff works, how the mechanics of it all work. But we have these characters like the Blind Warrior, I'm now going to call him because I cannot pronounce anything, who offers a certain kind of mystical reading of the Force at the same time. So yeah, I don't know. It's to me, both the character and the film are playing with and not quite sure whether to explain the Force or to leave it unexplained.
Yeah, he does. He's interesting in that regard because he does fall into getting into some of the material that I talk about in the blog. Because it wasn't my idea, but the research that I referenced made me realise that there's this interesting trope with depictions of blind people sometimes in action, science fiction or fantasy films. They can fall into the stereotype of wise old sage as well as being blind. And Chirrut could come across that way. And this kind of falls into, I think, what Alex has just said in terms of, the franchise tries to leave some of this loose explanation around the Force, and someone that understands it, like Chirrut, falls into this stereotype character of wide old sage. Maybe that helps to identify, some of that tropes that Star Wars falls into, whether the characters aren't blind or not. There's actually quite a few wise old sages who think they're explaining the Force in a useful way, but if you pay attention to, as I say, to a lot of detail, you might end up more confused and clarified.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing because when the director and the writers come out and say this is not going to be a film which has Jedis in it, it's not going to be a film like The Force, this is about the war, and this is going to be about the battle, almost what they're saying is this isn't going to be a fantasy, this is going to be a kind of much more science, sort of like in the mode of, say, Dune or something like that, right? A sort of maybe a traditional space opera or something like that, or that has fantastical elements often, but a more grounded, rationalistic worldview in the science fiction universe. And yet, when the film comes out, actually, there's a lot of Force going on in it. There's a lot of stuff, and some of the most, the scenes that they clearly want to be the most spectacular involve either, this blind warrior kind of, either, engaging with the Force and using it in his own sort of, trying to embody it whilst also being distanced from it, which I think is an interesting way of doing it, or we get the kind of spectacular Darth Vader reveals and things where we get the Force being used in its kind of operatically evil manner. Yeah, which is a great
climax to the film. I do really like the film, but I'm also sure that they put it in there. I can understand that they put it in there just to, satisfy the fans. I think fans are wanting to be seeing that for years. Darth Vader just take on a room full of bad guys like that. Well, not bad guys, room full of good guys. Sorry,
a room full of people.
So, what I suppose Star Wars is in a sticky situation because it's the world of Star Wars has been parodied and satirized to an extent where when I was watching Rogue One, I was thinking about the sort of Family Guy, Blue Harvest, It's a Trap, that kind of stuff, and so. It's difficult, actually, and we were talking before we started about all these different transmedia franchises, but the way in which all these transmedia products where you have the Star Wars universe that is now spilling out into animated series, Star Wars, The Clone Wars, onto streaming platforms and all these supporting series. So there's a lot of work that goes into fleshing out the world of Star Wars and introducing a really incredible range of characters with fabulous names that are very difficult to remember, pronounce, and spell, but would make great Scrabble scores. So, what do you think Rogue One is trying to do? It's trying to tell a story before we get to A New Hope. But in terms of what it's doing, is it fleshing out the world and introducing new characters and creating new relationships? I mean, I don't know because I'm not as well versed in Star Wars as you, but I just wondered if you're going to try and pitch a film like Rogue One. Solo, I can understand because it's about the origin story of your protagonist, let's say. But Rogue One, what I liked actually about Rogue One is it didn't feel like, certainly for the first hour and 15, didn't feel like it had a protagonist. Yeah. But there was a lot of different characters, and I was trying to keep my head, get my head around all the different relationships and that sort of stuff. So Rogue One seems to be less enthralled to let's tell the origin story of our hero that would go on to be I nearly said Napoleon Solo, but I meant Han Solo. What is Rogue One doing in this sense? What's the purpose of it within the Star Wars universe?
I hate to gossip because I don't hate to gossip.
You?
I love it. Obviously, this film has had quite publicised behind-the-scenes shenanigans in terms of...
Yeah, there was a lot of that.
I can't help feel that the film that it once was an attempt to kind of do what The Mandalorian does with Season 1, which is, can you tell a story with the Star Wars brand, in a Star Wars universe that is actually just on its own, unique characters, different tone, different style, different genre. And I wonder whether the original version of this film, which is still sort of there in its spine, was a kind of band of brothers. First half, let's get the team together. Second half, let's do the mission, kind of Where Eagles Dare. That kind of movie that didn't pay quite so much homage to the lore of what this all sets up, other than the kind of tangential, it's based on a line from the original movie. And slowly, again, a bit like Mandalorian, what seems to have happened is the kind of unbearable expectation of fandom has turned it into a film that is feels much more in need to sort of be about how Star Wars became Star Wars than I think perhaps it could have been. I'm less interested in the as much as it is kind of cool, the Darth Vader bits and the time to get into CGI, bringing people back from the dead and all that kind of stuff, than I am learning about the characters of the Rogue One squadron, who I feel are actually, I would like more time with them and less explosions, you know.
Which is also interesting to note. I'm not keeping up with every bit of news about the Star Wars universe, though I have watched this since a very young age, as I think Alex mentioned as well. Disney have listened to some fan reaction of that, because we are going to get a Cassian Andor series, which is going to be a prequel to Rogue One, prequel series to Rogue One. Because I think, thinking back on this film, that's what I always reminded of as well. And it was, again, talked a lot with the reception of the film. It had this Where Eagles Dare tone, or A Dirty Dozen was being used as a comparison a lot. And in a lot of the plot lines, especially from Andor's character, we get the impression that the rebellion has had to do some dirty things to stay on the right side of the Empire and their machinations against them. It almost feels the first time, apart from when we see Anakin turn to Darth Vader, maybe in Episode 3, for the first time we're starting to get a depiction of the shades of grey of war, especially through, and again, this got a lot of criticism at the time, kind of the extremist factions that there seemed to be in the rebellion, with Forrest Whitaker's character. Saw Gerrera. That's it, yeah.
So I thought I'd jump in because that's the only time on the podcast I'll ever get to do that. So,
at the start of Rogue One, Cassian Andor kills a character.
Yeah, kills another character.
And I thought, hang on a minute, I don't know.
They're good guys, they're not supposed to do that.
Yeah, they were good guys, they're not supposed to do that. And the reason I remember it is because I really like the actor Daniel Mays, who he kills in the thing. And I thought, that's really interesting. Daniel Mays is in the film, and also he's just been killed by this guy who's... Sure. And I did wonder whether the character, given that he's played by Diego Luna, we were gonna do that with othering. We were gonna make the villain the other, and the hero or the heroine, the white woman played by Felicity Jones. So I was just... I wasn't sure what the film was setting up. The shades of grey seemed to make more sense with regards to having to do dirty things, as you said.
There are all these intriguing bits of it. Like, as I say, I want to know more about Saw Gerrera. I want to know more about this kind of the extremist faction that you can't align yourself with because they have too far. I want to, and I want to, when they're on that kind of in Jeddah, where we essentially meet the bands, don't we? It's the first 2 hours of Seven Samurai, isn't it? You know,
I'm reminded of, there was some, I can't remember if there's reviews at the time or how the film has been revisited and criticised since. The first Star Wars film was sometimes paralleled with the fights in Vietnam or guerrilla warfare. In terms of, sometimes the rebellion was read as like the Viet Cong acting against the imperialist army that was invading them, or that sort of allegory. And I think we get a lot of that in Star Wars Rogue One, especially where it's set Jeddah. It does sound like somewhere in the Middle East where there is a guerrilla warfare force fighting against an outside invader.
I mean, they talk about the Holy City quite a lot, don't they?
They do call it the Holy City.
So there's a whole kind of way of reading it as kind of Israel-Palestine and and
Exactly.
dominating forces coming onto this place. We've got the Empire literally looming above it in its big Star Destroyer versus the Rebellion are trying to use it for their own devices. Yeah, so I think there's some really interesting things in the movie. I think it's a better movie to think about than it is to watch, because I do think that also it just falls into a bit too much action set piece mentality and a bit too much. I think the problem is that if you're a Star Wars fan that grew up with Star Wars, what you really, really want to do in your heart of hearts is not have seen Star Wars and rewatch it again for the first time. And to satisfy that impossible demand, you have to somehow give people a new Star Wars that doesn't do any damage to the relationship they have with the old text. It can't explain anything, add anything, because that's all choices and decisions. It can't augment or change or extend, and yet it somehow has to be new at the same time and not just be Force Awakens.
Yeah, I completely take your point that they're maybe trying to do a bit too much of this with Rogue One. Maybe it's just me and my personal opinion. I do still really like Rogue One a lot, but I'm going to be biased because there's the Zatoichi character in it. But I also take on your point. They're trying to satisfy, those diehard Star Wars fans at the same time, because not only are they digital de-aging people and resurrecting them from the dead, they are actually replaying some moments from A New Hope. I don't know if you saw that when with the pilots, some of the pilots, they're using those pilots' faces from their attack on the Death Star at the end of the 77 film.
I'm nodding, listeners.
I am not.
Chris is bemused. Right. We'll come on to the character. We've sort of touched on how he's originated, but I think he is the most interesting character in the film, so I definitely want to revisit that. We better talk about CGI and bringing people back from the dead and de-aging, because this is, come on, Chris, this is your baby. So,
well, actually, there are two. I suppose there are. Before I say that, I having done a bit of research into George Lucas and the relationship between Lucasfilm, the emergent computer graphics group that would then become Pixar, because Lucasfilm had a relationship to let's say practical miniature effects and models and things like this, its newly incumbent CG arm was often described as Lucasfilm's rebel unit. It was the thing that
oh, really?
Yeah, it was used as a kind of analogy to think about. We have this tradition in practical effects, and now we've got this digital rebellion that are doing things slightly differently, and ultimately would be bought by Steve Jobs and become Pixar. And I'm sort of more interested in the Lucas era phase of Pixar, let's say, or the relationship that Lucasfilm has with the computer graphics group and the hiring of a bunch of people from the University of Utah that would then become and be spun out as Pixar. So there is something interesting about the idea of the digital being a rebellious force within the world of Star Wars, and within the world of production, that these were young animators, a lot of practical animators, practical effects artists were of a certain age. They were literally handing over the reins to this young...
So they were sort of splintered off and kicked out almost of the...
Yeah, because practical effects would be a thing of the past. Let's hand the baton to digital effects. This rebel group of young, fresh out of college people. Anyway, so there's that interesting kind of... The idea of the rebel unit has been used sort of symbolically.
And the relationship between digital technology and the whole franchise is very interesting.
Well, and certainly...
Fans often, do that thing where they say, oh, we don't want any CGI, and actually there's loads of CGI in all of them, and there always has been.
Yeah, I think there's a relationship between the Phantom Menace, where I know the pod race, the crowds were built through cotton buds that were dipped in different coloured paints, and that made the crowd. 2, 3, 4 years later, Attack of the Clones, which has often been described as just a big toy advert done with... That was the film where Ewan McGregor came out and said he was doing a lot of his dialogue to a tennis ball on a stick.
Sure.
The CG character Jar Jar Binks, I think, is also symbolic of the franchise's thorny, let's use it again, oil and water relationship to CGI.
But here we get CGI being used to bring back the spirit, almost literally, of the old trilogy.
So I'm interested in as you well and have beautifully set up, Alex, thank you, digital de-aging, and specifically digital de-aging technologies within franchise features, because often de-aging is used as kind of the connective digital tissue, let's say, that connects up franchise features, in some cases made 40 years apart in the instance of... So a lot of films that you get digital de-aging are in things where even the titles of the films speak to temporality. Yeah. So your Endgames, your X-Men Origins, your Terminator Dark Fate, a lot of it is
Tron
about...
Legacy,
Tron
Legacy.
Legacy.
As well, yeah.
Rogue One is a good example because it kind of does a couple of things. I think on the one hand, it brings back from the dead... which is not strictly de-aging. So the distinction is between Peter Cushing and at that time Carrie Fisher, because at that time Carrie Fisher was with us, and what we were seeing was
this was released between the two. Was it?
It was released before Last Jedi. Yeah.
So,
I think it was just as Last Jedi was coming out, she passed away.
Absolutely.
But then, but I think the backlash against it perhaps precipitated the fact that in the third of the new ones, it was not digital kind of reconstruction, it was archived footage from the previous.
Yeah.
So when we see Carrie Fisher aged as she is or she was then, embracing Daisy Ridley, that's actually footage cut out. They haven't chosen to reconstruct it through technology because I think of the backlash towards some of this technology.
There is also, I mean, whether it should be a difference is one thing, but there is also a kind of effective difference.
Yes.
It feels less murky to do it to Peter Cushing, who is sadly long gone, and a recently deceased member of the cast.
Yeah, so you have, at the end of the film, you have the simulation of the younger Carrie Fisher, whose digital face was, and I wrote down the name of the actress, Ingvild Dahler, who performed the scene with kind of facial markers on her face, and the digital skin was attached to the final shot.
So that's interesting, because when I know you've written on this, because unfortunately you talk to me outside of this podcast and I have to listen to you sometimes. But
then why don't you return my calls? Next question.
Let's have this fight off there. When you've talked about examples of males de-aging, it's the male performer that comes on set and puts the digital dots on his face. Samuel L. Jackson, Robert Downey Jr. Right. So it begs the question: why didn't Carrie Fisher do it? And what is that because she's a woman, or is that because she didn't want to do it? Or
I don't know. Of course, yes. One of the interesting.
It almost feels like recasting her, right? You know, you get the guy to put on a baseball cap in the sort of 80s when they're playing a teenage version of themselves, because men can sort of be any age and women have to be all 20.
Yes, of course, there is a heavily gendered dimension to digital de-aging, and it's largely a technology that's used in service of actually youthening a particular kind of 1980s masculinity, strangely. So there are de-aged examples from the film Grudge Match of Stallone, of De Niro, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2's Kurt Russell, the Terminator films is Arnold Schwarzenegger. So the use of
Jr.,
but a particular kind, Jeff Bridges, a particular kind of 1980s masculinity that is being de-aged. It's often not a technology afforded to women. There are a couple of examples that kind of prove the rule, really. So Michelle Pfeiffer at the beginning of the second Ant-Man, and Sean Young in the new Blade Runner, but that's kind of
There's been a recent one as well. Have you seen The Adam Project?
Yes.
It's a digital.
Catherine Keener.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Sean Young wasn't from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't involved in Blade Runner.
No, she wasn't involved in Blade Runner. No,
so that's two examples
actress.
now of two actresses not being used.
So in the case of, I mean, it's interesting in the case of Blade Runner because that's sort of justified by the fact the character is already artificial because of being a replicant. However, you're right that Carrie Fisher was not and Sean Young was not. I don't know whether they have to kind of license their image. I'm sure they do.
It's almost like it's easier to get another young woman
and just stick a face on.
And put Carrie Fisher's face on it, then get Carrie Fisher's face and de-age it, because how on earth could you do that? You know?
Yeah, it's interesting why they didn't do that, because they did bring back, of course, James Earl Jones to do the voice of Vader in Rogue One.
Okay.
So, I mean, the audio component to this is also an interesting issue, because you often have the de-aged image, but you have the aged voice. So actually you have Kurt Russell speaking, but you have...
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's an interesting one because you, in the case of often male digital de-aging, you have the scene performed twice, once by the body double, and then once by the aged star, and then the two sequences are kind of pushed together. But at least there seems to be a bit of agency afforded to the male star in a way that there isn't in the case of Carrie Fisher. I would say that in order to pursue authenticity, and the Star Wars products have done this a couple of times, they always maintain that authentic audio is used. So you have Carrie Fisher's audio files, let's say.
Yeah, it's one word in Rogue One, isn't it? It's just the one word, hope.
And then you come to that in a second.
And then you have Mark Hamill, I think, for a couple of episodes of either Mandalorian or Boba Fett, you have his speech was actually put through a sound synthesizer to make it younger. So they're even using the authentic voice as part of a. And I do wonder. I mean, digital de-aging is you have a couple of examples prior to 2016. Of course you do. But 2016 is also the same year as Captain America: Civil War, which was the big. We're now going to have a sequence which Robert Downey Jr. describes as Tony Stark in the film as retro-framing the future, which is a title of an upcoming article. Just slip that in there. But that is a sequence where digital de-aging is actually. The sequence is about de-aging, like it's kind of presenting it front and center. But the agency of kind of female performers within this, I think, is really kind of problematic because almost like not only are male stars like your Clint Eastwood. Basically, if you're not Judi Dench, Meryl Streep, or Helen Mirren, you aren't a woman making a movie. Basically, you have to. They're the legitimate older females,
and you can't even be in movies where you're in them.
Yeah, so not only can Clint Eastwood still be making films and directing films in his 90s, basically. So not only are male performers and male stars allowed to grow old, they're also afforded de-aging technologies more so than their female counterparts. Whereas what Hollywood will just do is just not cast an older character above, or an older female above a certain age, and just cast Jennifer Lawrence instead. The sequences with Peter Cushing, that combines de-aging with another kind of body that's kind of common to contemporary Hollywood, what Lisa Bode has termed posthumous performance.
Yeah.
Something that she traces back from Gene Kelly dancing in the golf adverts, television advert, breakdancing in the rain, to Gladiator, Oliver Reed, that kind of posthumous.
Oh, and you've just reminded me, there was I think it was a Galaxy advert where they brought back Audrey Hepburn.
Yes, Audrey Hepburn.
Oh, yes,
The Albert Einstein adverts that are currently on television where he's like sitting in the bath. These sort of playful, bringing digital reconstructions of performers. So Lisa Bode calls this posthumous performance where basically computer graphics reanimate and kind of reconjure deceased stars as live performing bodies after. And a lot of stuff I remember around Rogue One was from the Peter Cushing estate going, no, they're fine with it, it's fine. He was fine with it, and it's like, well, it's still a bit kind of dodgy to see the actor Guy Henry have his face stuck Peter Cushing's face on it. Yeah. So there's that. So there's kind of, the film does two kinds of things. It does the strict de-aging, although that actually has now become posthumous in the case of Carrie Fisher. And then at the time, the posthumous performances of Peter Cushing that were kind of composed by composited footage of photographs and film footage and stuck on an actor's face, who was allowed to speak as himself as well.
He was,
so that's really interesting.
He did speak about, I was at the May 2017 MCM Comic-Con, because that was when I just started working at Greenwich. So that month when I started, I was like, oh, this is happening across the road. I'm going to go. And Guy Henry did a panel as well, talking about funnily enough, the digital de-aging process and, trying to do this voice that he said he was trying to respect Peter Cushing, not try to do so much of an impression, though it does sound that way. And it's also interesting listening to what you've just been saying. Essentially, this process is taking a digital mock-up of Peter Cushing's face and putting it on Guy Henry. You kind of see the bones of that, the evidence of it, of interpreting it that way in the extras on Rogue One, as well as the process that he talks about, acting with this machinery on his face.
I think I can't remember exactly, there is another de-aged version of Carrie Fisher that appears in one of the newer...
In Rise of Skywalker.
That was Carrie Fisher's daughter, Billie Lourd. So that was so when Carrie Fisher was alive, they didn't get her involved, and then once she died, they got her daughter to come in and perform.
And she was already acting in the two earlier newer Star Wars films.
So she performs as her mother in there. So anyway, so there's lots of interesting stuff around de-aging, and this was sort of a moment, I think, for digital de-aging. Now it's really popular, of course.
You mentioned the one word that Carrie Fisher, not Carrie Fisher, says in this movie, which is hope. And I just want to very briefly talk about that, and that might be because I've spent the last year reading works of St. Augustine, and I'm kind of getting very interested in ideas of Christian hope.
Me too.
Hope keeps being mentioned in this movie as this like thematic, right? That a rebellion is built on hope. They say that a couple of times. It's a kind of key thing, and it just made me think about the ways in which, and we've sort of touched on this already, the Jedi mythology, religion is attempted to be explained in this movie, and I think the way it tries to do it, treading that line we've already set up, is to not necessarily explain the Force, but give a bit more background to the kind of infrastructure and the religious infrastructure that is being or the religion of the Jedi in this world.
Yeah,
there's a bit in The Last Jedi where Luke reveals the kind of Jedi
temple, or the final...
and the books of the Jedi, right?
That's it, yeah.
So I'm interested in that because actually, as much as we've talked about this being indebted to kind of a loose collection of East Asian sort of religious structures, it would seem to me that actually the more Jedi religion is explained, the more the structures are explained. We're actually going down quite a sort of Judeo-Christian Islamic kind of route in that we get biblical texts, we get things that look not unlike mosques and synagogues, and we get this kind of recurrent theme of hope powering the movie, which is a very fundamental kind of Christian virtue. The only way it can try to conceptualize what being a Jedi or following the Jedi religion might look like is to actually take it down a much more kind of institutional Western framework. I don't know if that's struck anyone at all. Is that a tension with some of the other kind of nods to Eastern cultures?
It could be interpreted that way with like kind of East Asian overtones. I would say, well, historically, and there is still to this day, there are arms of Christianity and other religions in East Asian countries.
Of course,
these things have always been mashed up. And I think if you look on a genre perspective, these things have always been mashed up in Star Wars, because Star Wars has always been talked about as having these East Asian influences. Most specifically, I didn't mention the film by name earlier, but Alex probably knows The Hidden Fortress.
Oh, yes.
Have you seen The Hidden Fortress?
I have, years ago.
Yeah. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's startling watching the beginning of that film. The medieval characters that turn up are exactly like the characters of R2-D2 and C-3PO. You can quite clearly see where George Lucas gets some of these ideas. But Star Wars has also been described quite often as a space Western. So it's often mashed up these East Asian ideals with these Western ideals. So it would make sense, I guess if they're mashing these things together, if they're touching on wider religious themes, there'll be elements of East Asian mysticism and religion, and why not also Judeo-Christian symbology.
Yeah.
So is there not... I mean, I'm just writing this down. Judeo, Jedi.
Yeah, there could be a link.
So there's because there's a lot of I'm doing some frantic googling about the relationships.
I'm really annoyed I didn't see that earlier in terms of Jidaigeki linking that to Jedi. Of course, Lucas did that. Of course he did.
Yeah, but I was just thinking about. I think when we've taught the Jidaigeki and we've taught Humanity and Paper Balloons,
I remember it well.
That just made me think the Jidaigeki versus the Jedi, and then also these sorts of religious. I don't know. There's just a nice sort of.
Reminds me of, I won't say who, but another critic I heard of on another podcast was really annoyed when someone else had to point out to them in The Northman that's out at the moment, Amleth is an anagram of Hamlet.
Oh, look at that. There was something that we were talking about earlier with regards to whether or not the film is at its best when it's not trying to have those threads to later Star Wars films. And I think the point about Darth Vader is right. I think the Carrie Fisher sort of quote-unquote cameo does work, but maybe that's just because it's the last shot of the film.
Yeah. It's an interesting ending to kind of end with our characters and then have another kind of 5 minutes. And it's, I quite like that.
I think the Darth Vader chasing down the rebel soldiers onto the ship does work. Yeah. I'm not so sure about the other scene where he turns up. I'm not quite sure why that is so necessary.
When he crushes
the director Krennic.
Having the time of his life.
Who also features in Captain Marvel.
Right,
So no, I just thought that was something that cropped up earlier, whether the film is at its best when it's sort of not trying to whether those links to later Star Wars films are there for the fans. I mean, it's very difficult when talking about Star Wars films because of the power that the fans have, but also to try and give over too much power to the fans in terms of the shape of these things. But it seems like the film is really great for the first hour and 10, 15 minutes where it's giving us all these different... And actually when Darth Vader does appear, which is around...
it's around the midpoint, I think.
Soon after the hour mark, it sort of tries to do some... tries to do some connectivity that perhaps doesn't quite pay off. I don't know.
I actually think the second half's the stronger half. I just wish I had more investment in the characters to really be affected by what happens. Because actually, I actually find Jyn Erso not a particularly interesting character. I think there's probably there's the grounds for her to be interested. She's not given enough space and time to sort of breathe on the screen to kind of. And I feel that with a lot of the characters, I need another 2 or 3 scenes of them just being for a bit rather than running away from her.
More Mads Mikkelsen, But that's
more
true.
Mads
That's true of so
most
much.
films.
Of course, I'm going to say I'd love to see more Chirrut and,
Sure,
Baze as well, because I
Yeah.
think that dynamic duo of Baze
agree.
relying on his massive machine gun or blaster, I should say. It's basically a machine gun though. Paired up with Chirrut Îmwe's martial arts skills. I'd love to see that, but I'm sure Donnie Yen and Jiang Wen are maybe too busy for that.
Yeah.
But we are going to get more Cassian Andor.
Yeah, so that would be interesting to see, absolutely. And more Riz Ahmed would be good for me. Again,
true of most films.
True of most films.
Yeah.
So and more Forrest Whitaker. Not true of most films.
No. So there are some seeds in the film that
Yeah.
perhaps need a little watering, but could. Yeah, I mean,
It's a good movie. I think it's a good movie.
I liked it. I haven't seen Solo, but it seems like I don't know. There's a move by the Star Wars universe. I don't know whether this is kind of true in kind of industry terms, but a move towards more long form television programs.
It seems to be that way.
Space where these kinds of stories can unfold.
I wanted to go back to one point that you mentioned earlier. Really interesting. It reminded me of the roots of ILM and
Lucas,
just before going into the Pixel era. That's interesting. Talking about the origins of Rogue One, because again, he's interviewed on the Blu-ray extras, and I think this is probably what in the material that's on Disney Plus now. The original story, one of the original people credited with the story of Rogue One. There's different script writers that fleshed out into the screenplay, but one of the original story credits is John Knoll, who is American visual effects supervisor and chief creative officer apparently at Industrial Light and Magic. So the original kernel of the story came from one of the Industrial Light and Magic special effects artists.
Right.
And then they developed this, into the more fully fleshed out script and the film.
Yeah, because it's funny, because Lucasfilm, there's a lot of stuff around, what would happen if George Lucas had never sold off Pixar and he kept hold of that kind of group of the computer graphics lab, as it was, the CGM. And this comes from the fact that it took Lucasfilm a long time. Lucasfilm created a Lucasfilm animation division to make computer animation, and what they've tended to do is make basically Star Wars, they make Clone Wars television.
Yeah.
They've leaned.
Was this before LucasArts as well? They're quite prominent video game arm.
So Lucasfilm Animation, I think, is 2011. That's when it was.
Oh right, okay.
When it's formed, because prior to then it had been a studio for hire, helping out, doing kind of stuff for Rango and other films we've done on the podcast. So Lucasfilm's relationship to computer animation is an interesting one. One, because they're there right at the start. Two, because they sold Pixar, and kind of Lucas hands things over to Steve Jobs. And then three, Lucasfilm finally moves into computer animation production, but makes the Clone Wars series and sort of does some other stuff. But they've tended to lean more to. I mean, the Star Wars franchise has obviously been very lucrative for Lucasfilm, so they keep within that world quite.
Yeah, but I remember before the Disney takeover, there were lots of spin-offs and like unofficial or like storylines. Alex might know a bit about this. There was lots of spin-off book series, like unofficial canon stories.
I know nothing about.
I haven't read or played a lot of these, but there was a lot of this going on. And I also remember, that LucasArts was quite prominent for making a lot of Star Wars games before, again, the Disney takeover.
And there was a massive thing when the Disney takeover happened about which of those things were canon and not
exactly.
canon. Right?
Yeah. Some of them, which they seem to go back to with characters that they're reintroducing into The Mandalorian, which is interesting. And I also remember that LucasArts was quite prominent for other video games it made. I'm trying to rack my brain for the titles now because I didn't actually play a lot of them, but I'm wondering how much of that fed into then the LucasArts animation and later animation. You may be aware of some of this. People like Richard McCulloch might also be more aware of that.
No, I think I remember something in Variety, which was the image of George Lucas basically signing off and signing away and giving Disney access to characters, but also kind of the effects units and the kind of production side of things. But
infiltrating the Death Star's plans by now, so we better wrap up.
We haven't quite said hope yet.
No. So yes,
I'll come back another day to talk about Daredevil if you want to make a Marvel reference to Zatoichi.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Absolutely. Yeah. Before you go though, for this time, Jonathan, tell us just a little bit about where we can find your book and how we can access it.
And something about an anniversary and a code.
Tell us all about
it.
Plug away.
There is a discount code. I will email that to you afterwards. I might have done that already.
We'll stick it in the show notes.
There is a discount code. Hopefully, listeners are hearing this soon in the year 2022 because that's the only year the discount code is valid for. Because this year is the 60th anniversary of the Zatoichi
We
franchise.
wouldn't dare not have this episode.
No, sure, but listeners may dare listen to it.
Yes, they will listen.
Yes. So if you're listening to this after 2022, that discount code is no longer valid, but that will be on the Fantasy Animation website. You can find other information about my publications. Well, Chris did a great job of summarising that earlier from my Greenwich profile page.
Yeah, we'll link to that too. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, and also this should be recorded after it goes out, so you should be able to watch that on YouTube after the fact on the 5th of May 2022. I'm doing an online book launch, so that'll be watchable on YouTube after that, mainly focusing on the Zatoichi character. I don't think we'll be talking about as Rogue One as much on that online.
We've done it here. We've done it here.
And you're on Twitter?
I am on Twitter, yes, at JL Wroot.
Okay. Please do follow, and then
Yeah.
you can keep everyone up to date there as well. Terrific. Well, I guess there's not much more to say. Thank you very much, Jonathan,
Yeah, thank
for
you.
coming
Thank
on
you
the
both.
podcast.
It's been a
really,
great chat.
Really interesting way of getting back into a film I've seen a few times and thinking it through with different lenses. So, yeah, really
I think a really great way to do Star Wars without doing Star Wars in perhaps the traditional sense.
I don't know, one of these days we better do Star Wars, but I'm enjoying this way of doing it.
Do the other ones first.
Okay, right. Well, like Rogue One, I better set up the next instalment with the admin. So, right, you can follow us at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and you can email us at that same address if you have any footnote suggestions. Did we mention anything that passed you by that you want us to clarify in 10 minutes? We will happily do that on a future episode. fananimresearch@gmail.com. This episode was produced and edited by Leon Waldo. Thank you very much to his ongoing help. And you can visit the website, of course, if you want to read Jonathan's blog and anything else we've written on Star Wars, VFX, de-aging.
All that jazz.
All that stuff, you know what's on there. Have a look. fantasy-animation.org. But that's been us for another episode, and we will see you next time.
Bye.